Hi, everybody. Really excited to talk to you about Alone Season 9, Episode 3. We are finally really starting to get into some of the meaty stuff in Alone. We're seeing more people at once. There's a lot going on. Particularly, I'm going to be focusing on talking a lot about their shelters. And in this episode, I am going to tell you what I think is the best shelter we have seen yet on Episode 3. So before you hear what I have to say about it, I would love you to write in the comments what you think is the best shelter we've seen so far out there. So let's go ahead and dive into some of the nitty-gritty details of Episode 3 in Labrador. I'm also going to be talking about both beaver and bear as food out there and talk about what is really good and not as good about both of those different types of game. So we start off with Jessie, who we haven't seen since Episode 1, and she is getting ready to dive into shelter. I love what Jessie says about building into the hillside here and how it isn't something that we've seen very often on Alone, but how building into a solid piece like the ground behind her on that hillside and using live trees isn't something that we've seen a lot of on Alone. And I love this. It is so important to always be looking at labor-saving techniques and things that make your shelter really strong without you having to do a lot of it. And Jessie, I actually did build several live trees into my shelter. They were supporting the front cross pieces and also supporting part of the back of my shelter. So I love where you're going with this, and I think it's definitely a really good idea. I will say that I have some trepidation seeing Jessie moving those huge logs and watching it. I was like, oh God, is she going to build her whole shelter with these enormous trees? Because it is a huge risk. It is a lot of calorie expenditure, and it's also putting heavy things up high where there's more danger of potentially them coming down. And it also puts her at risk of injury when she is building with them. So I was picturing her going the whole way up with those huge logs, something like Roland Welker did building Rock House on Season 7. Now, Roland did really well with that shelter, but I had to say that I really didn't feel like it was a great choice going in. It worked out for him. It's always a gamble, but the risk of injury, both something falling on you and muscle strain out there, and spending the amount of calories that it takes to move huge rocks and logs like that, not a great call for most people. Again, it worked out for Roland, but I was really happy to see that those were only the sill logs in Jessie's shelter. She's not trying to build her whole thing out of huge logs like that. So given that, I'm excited for her plans to build into that hillside and excited to see where it's gonna go. We next go to Igor, who again we haven't seen for a while, and there he is eating another pot of seaweed. Definitely not ideal to have nothing but seaweed to be eating, but given that nobody else seems to have seaweed, what a huge boon and what a great resource that is for Igor, right? Something to have anyway. And little tip, eating a lot of seaweed, really good for staying regular, which is a big deal out there that we often don't see in these episodes, but I will refer you to my video about pooping on Alone, also on this YouTube channel. A lot of important things that a lot of people don't think about and they don't tend to highlight on the show. Really excited to see Igor on this episode and to let you guys know that Igor has confirmed being on one of my live Q&A calls that's happening on June 21st, just for my Patreon members. So if you are interested in getting to ask Igor all of your questions, then please join he and I and all of the rest of the team on Patreon for that call on June 21st. So we see Igor getting started on a log cabin, and I have to say that we have seen a lot of people start really ambitious shelter projects like log cabins on Alone, and I would say probably 50% of the people have finished those shelters. We have seen a lot of people taken out on Alone by starting over ambitious shelters that they never end up finishing. We saw it with Joe on Season 7, where he was doing timber framing, awesome building technique, lots of energy, can be really slow. It's a risk, and I'm curious to see how it's gonna work out for Igor, because he's already talking about how tired he is, and he's not that very far into the time, and he's only gonna have less reserves in his body as time goes on, right? Lots of ambitious shelters on this season. Back to Adam with the awesome shelter that we saw him starting on the last episode, and now we see him making a major improvement to that. A chimney, a way to have your fire burning efficiently and get the smoke out of your shelter, is super, super key. So I love that Adam is thinking about that. First one we've seen since Juan Pablo's awesome wood stove, really putting effort into a chimney tile style of system. And I think it's a really, really good call. And again, what an awesome resource to have clay on site. And I love his idea of chopping up the grass and making cob, because just clay on its own isn't particularly strong. So the grass, the vegetative matter, it's like rebar in concrete. It's what makes the clay actually have tensile strength and makes it strong. So it makes it possible to build with it. It also keeps it from shrinking and expanding as much when it gets wet or hot cold, which is going to help keep it from cracking. That said, usually with cob, we're mixing in a lot of gravel or sand, and that's also what really helps keep it from cracking. So without that, I'm curious to see how this chimney is going to hold up long term. I'm thinking with a lot of, shrinking and expanding, hot, cold, and the moist climate out there, he's maybe going to run into some cracking issues with that chimney going on. So then we come back to Jessie, and now Jessie is working on some squirrel poles. Now I will say that the way I was taught to do squirrel poles is on really narrow poles so that the squirrels don't have a broad highway where they can just sidestep your snare wire. So curious to see how these are going to work, and really excited to see her putting in a solid effort towards getting food. I will say that while I love the idea of digging into the hillside for her shelter is looking monstrous. It's looking really big and really elaborate, and we can see she's putting in a lot of effort driving those pegs and wedging things in. So it's not just the calories that she's putting in building that shelter, but it's the calories that it's going to require to heat, because she has to cut and haul all of the firewood to heat that thing. And no matter how much she's burning in a shelter that's that big and that tall, because heat rises, it's still going to be cold in there. So she's going to be using body heat to keep her body warm in a shelter that big. So we'll see how it ends up turning out, but not the way I would go with such a big shelter. I really love Jessie talking about the impact that our lives have on the natural world out there versus back home. So many people, particularly watching these shows, and we saw this with Jacques too, right? Feeling like, oh God, it's so hard to have to be out here killing things in order to live. And for the viewer at home, geez, these people are killing so many squirrels and grouse, right? I love that Jessie points out a fact that I bring up to people all the time, especially people who think that vegetarian or vegan lifestyle has less impact on animals. Industrial agriculture is one of the most harmful things to wild creatures in the world, right? Because we are destroying habitat, we are making a huge imprint. We are burning a ton of fossil fuels. The number of squirrels and field mice and ground squirrels and moles and voles that get killed every time a crop of wheat is harvested is so much more than what people are doing out there in that spot. But when we're in our comfortable little homes, we have the luxury of not seeing our impacts, right? We don't see the lives that we're taking in order to support that lifestyle. Out there, it is right in your face. It is 100% real. So it feels like bigger impact, but it's actually a lot less impact than the way most of us live at home. And I love that Jessie brings that in. I am 100% with you, Jessie. Also, oh my gosh, so excited to see Jessie get a squirrel on that squirrel pole. So they worked. Those branches kept the squirrels to the pole in the middle, and they were able to get through those snares. And it's really nice to see Jessie eating for the first time. Eating meat for the first time, I should say. That said, I will say that I see her doing one thing that is always, to me, something to try to avoid, which is washing your game in water that is probably contaminated. There's this idea that meat and cleaned animals are inherently dirty and inherently have bad stuff we don't want to be eating on them, and we should clean them. I disagree with that. If you are really careful in cleaning an animal, you should be able to take all of the intestines, the stomach, all of the organs out without ever spilling any of the bile or the intestinal or stomach contents on the meat. So it's actually much cleaner if you don't rinse it off. If you cut the stomach or the gallbladder or the intestines, then that's obviously less true and you need to wash it. But the thing is, washing your game in water not only actually gets bacteria onto it, but it's also rinsing away the blood. And the blood is actually a really important calorie source, especially if you have one squirrel in 2 weeks, right? You want to be saving everything. Also, the fat that is coating all of the organs, that can float away in the water. So you're potentially using the most important source of food on that animal, and fat floats, right? So it's just going to float and go right on down that river. So I think it's really good to get in the habit of cleaning animals really well so that we don't have to rinse them and lose all of those wonderful calories to the water and potentially contaminate them more than they were in the first place. Meat's actually really clean. It's just the funk in the intestines that's the thing to worry about. Wow, that sunset behind Benji that morning, oh, so gorgeous, right? And here we see Benji also launching into building a shelter, and it's day 13. It's really late to be starting a shelter, but he was saying he was thinking about waiting until day 30 in episode 1. So I'm really glad that he didn't wait that long and that he's getting on his shelter right now. I would also say that it looks like he is building a pretty darn big shelter, way bigger than I think is what we want to aim for in a harsh climate like Labrador. Same as with Jessie, same as with any of the large shelters, so much more energy to build, so much more energy to heat, and just really not necessary in an environment like that. You can make an argument that being comfortable and be able to move easily is important, and it is to some degree, but it really comes down to calories out there, and it's just not a good equation to build a big shelter when you have limited calories. Also, Benji talks about that he wants to build a debris hut, but he's building this big structure. What I think of as a debris hut is a very small structure that's usually low to the ground and just a little bit bigger than your body. Because in a debris hut, the whole idea is that the big thickness of the debris is your insulation. So it's like a sleeping bag. It has to be so small that your body heat can warm it efficiently, because a debris hut is not designed to have a fire inside it. It's like one enormous tinder bundle. So not sure what Benji's talking about in terms of a debris hut and then building this really big, substantial structure. That's all going to be revealed. Maybe he just means heaping debris on top as insulation, which is a great call for sure. It's just not what I would consider a classic debris hut. And then we're back to Juan Pablo, and we get to see his site again. And yet again, dang, those are some thick woods. It looks like it's really hard to move around in there. We get to see again his freaking awesome resource of those cans. Man, there's so much that he can do with that. And so both making that bear alarm system and then making an actual bell, really sweet. What are you gonna do with an enormous nail like that? Cooking pot and nail together, making a bell. Really good idea. And I want to spend some time now talking about the idea of getting a bear on a loan. We talked about this a little bit with Jessie and her choice not to go after the bear that was sniffing around her shelter that first night. But here we've been seeing people talk about bears over and over. So want to go ahead and dive into that a bit. 100% agree with Juan Pablo that a bear out there is like gold. The thing about bears is that they are really similar to pigs in terms of meat in all kinds of ways. They're omnivores like pigs are. They're incredibly fatty like pigs are. They have similar teeth to pigs, and being omnivores, they also carry trichinosis just like pigs do. This is why there's so much around making sure that you cook pig thoroughly. Bear is the same way. Like pigs, you can make bacon out of bear, and their fat is really soft. So it's more what we would consider lard rather than tallow, which is a hard, waxy fat like you're going to get from things like moose and deer and muskox. So bear, super, super delicious and super rich and fatty source of meat. More calories in a chunk of bear meat than a lot of other types of meats. Most any that I know, honestly. So we're also going to be talking about beaver, also an amazing meat, but not quite as fatty as bear, certainly. So I agree that making a strategy around bear is a really smart way to go. The thing with bear is that because it carries trichinosis, you can't eat raw bear meat. So other meats you can smoke and dry over the fire and then eat as jerky. We've seen that Clay smoked and dried a lot of his deer on season 8. You can't do that with bear meat. You could get really, really sick. And Mark on season 7 got trichinosis out there, and he got super, super ill. Now, Mark is a friend of mine, so I know more of the backstory of him getting trichinosis than they showed on season 7, but he was so messed up. By the time he came out of the Arctic, he had fluid accumulating in his lungs, and he probably would have died had he not gotten medical attention right away. And the treatment was really intense. So trichinosis, you do not want to mess with. You don't want to risk it. So that means you had better not take a bear unless you know that you can deal with it quickly and efficiently, and you had better not plan on drying and eating your bear meat raw. So that means that it's really better to wait until it's cold weather to take a bear. On Alone, you don't have the luxury of just waiting until the perfect time, right? You've got to take every opportunity to get that food. But it's something that you really need to think about, because not only is raw bear meat dangerous to eat, you have to cook it. You can dry it, you just have to cook it first. But it's hard to dry because, again, it's so rich and fatty. It's one thing when all of the fat in an animal is on the outside, not marbled in the muscles, but between the skin and the muscles themselves, then you can take that off and it's easy to save. But bear meat, the fat is all through the meat. So that makes it harder to dry because fat and water don't mix, right? If you have really greasy meat, then it's just going to take a lot more heat and a lot more time for it to dry. So that is something to know about bear. Amazing resource, hard to process in more primitive conditions with less resources and when it's still warm out. So as with everything out there, it's something to think about and something you've got to weigh. So you need to know what you're doing to process bear and bear fat. That said, dang, I hope someone gets a bear this season. Really looking forward to seeing that. So far, we haven't had any repeats on the big game taken in Alone. We've had the very first big game was moose taken by Jordan Jonas, season 6. The reason why he was still doing really good when I was starving to death out there. Season 7, a muskox, dang, taken by Roland Welker. And then season 8, a deer taken by Clay Hayes. So 3 different animals, and this season, it seems like the big animal they have access to and tags for are bears. So we will see what happens. Good luck to all you guys banking on the bear as your main strategy. We've been hearing Juan Pablo and Adam certainly talk a lot about that. Back to Adam, and we see him making a fly tying vise out of a Leatherman lashed to a log. I loved that. I believe that what we are seeing Adam use is the Surge, which is the Leatherman model that I brought on season 6. And I think it is the way to go on Alone, I have to say. So I was excited to see him using that. I'm not 100% sure, but I believe that's what it was. I have another video about the Surge that I used on season 6 on my YouTube channel, so check that out. Really awesome to see him use the cushioned sole of his boot for a dry fly, because of course that cushion is foamy, so it makes a fly that's going to float on the water. I love that. I love what an awesome job he does with that fly. But I have to say that this shows one of those awesome trends that we see on Alone, which is that every season ups the game for all of the other seasons, right? I bet we're going to be seeing more people making dry flies out of shoe soles and dyeing their own hair for tying flies in the future, because that was so ingenuitive. And because Alone is a show that a lot of people, most of the people who go on Alone have watched it. I didn't until getting ready to go out, but most people are Alone fans. And so that means that you've already seen what works. So every single season, we see people getting a lot smarter with their strategies. We see them building on what other past participants have done. Those people who go out to a location that has already been on Alone, they have a huge advantage from seeing what works. So if we go out on another river, or if we go back to the same location, Big River in Labrador again, I bet we're going to see people taking everything that these folks have done and really running with it and being more successful with their food strategies, given knowing what they're going into. So super sweet job, Adam. Loved seeing that. And wow, that reflection when he's out there fishing, oh my gosh, so beautiful, and such a huge river, right? Functionally, it seems like it's almost as as big as a lake. It's so big. And definitely we are starting to see the fish dropping off a bit. Those first couple weeks, looks like it's still pretty warm. Lots of people doing really well with fish, but for sure fish, particularly salmonids, the things in the greater salmon family, which is char, which they have up there, Arctic char, and all of the salmons and all of the trout. Those fish in particular, once it gets colder out, they seek deep water. So Adam's talking about having shallow shoreline, so he's going to be having a much harder time bringing in fish as the season goes on, as is most everybody out there. And we see this over and over in other seasons. People are doing great on fishing and think that they can rely on that. We even saw Nicole letting a salmon go from her gill net early on season 2, assuming there's more fish out there, I'll keep getting them. But it's not the case, because the fish change their habits with the seasons just like every other creature. It's just we're so removed from their watery world that that's less intuitive for us, right? So hoping we'll still see people bringing in fish, but it's gonna be getting harder, and I'm suspecting people are gonna be getting hungrier, because everybody's dropping a lot of weight. And it's one thing to be out there functioning when you still have a lot of body fat to be burning, but once you're burning through your body fat, then not bringing in calories and not bringing in fatty calories becomes a much bigger deal. We see Jessie successful with her squirrel pole yet again, and this time we see a really intense scene of a mama squirrel, and it may be a mama and a baby, it may be two mates, we're not sure, but a mama squirrel who is really upset about her young being taken out by that snare. And yet again, Jessie talking about the impacts of life out there versus life here, right up in your face. But she says, look, I'm sorry, Mama Squirrel, but that's the way it is. It takes life to feed life, and 100% true. And I love that she had a different perspective on it than Jacques, in terms of recognizing that it's a myth that we're not having an impact in our normal lives just because that impact isn't up in our face. So given that we're seeing this young squirrel get taken out by Jessie, I want to talk a little bit about trapping and some of the things that a lot of us don't realize or don't think about when you're thinking about trapping. And that is that the pattern that she has seen, taking out a younger squirrel and having that wise mama squirrel that avoided those snares and that was yelling at her as she was setting up the snares, not getting caught, this is actually a common pattern. I found this out in the Arctic, and when I went and took a trapping class, which was awesome, with a wonderful professional trapper, learned that this is what we see. It is most often the juvenile males that are getting caught in traps. And just like teenage boys in our cultures, they tend to be the brash and the risk takers, right? It tends to be the mamas who are really cautious and don't take those kinds of risks, going slow, checking out those snares, saying, what is this thing that I don't recognize in my environment? But it's probably her young juvenile male that gets caught. And that is part of what trapping is about, particularly in the fall and in the winter months, those yearling males that were raised up by their mamas through the spring, through the summer abundance, and then the fall is the time that they are branching out and getting their own territories. And a lot of those don't make it because they are less experienced and they have to go and fend for themselves and find a territory, and a lot of the territories are already taken. So this is a thing where trapping actually can help support populations because it can reduce the competition of all those young juvenile males spreading out into other territories and potentially having a big impact on the females or the older males that are in those territories. So interesting wildlife biology fact that I didn't realize until taking a really great trapping course. And I have such a new understanding of trapping and how it all works now. So thank you so much, Ross, who taught me so much. Later in this episode, we finally come back around to Karie, who we met in episode 1 but haven't seen for a while, and we get to see her working on her shelter. Now, I hope nobody cheated and waited until now to write your comments about what you think was the best shelter, but I have to say I am 100% supportive of Karie's idea of her shelter and the way she's going about making it. I love that it is all sloped. There's no big flat surface that's going to be catching any of the rain coming down. Something that I noticed on Benji's shelter is that he had his sloped roof poles at the bottom, kind of like an eave pole. It was horizontal. It was perpendicular to the way the water is going to be coming down off of that shelter. What that means is that it's creating a big pool, right? It's a spot that that water is going to be collecting and likely eventually dripping through. So I really hope that Benji is going to go back and put vertical poles supporting that tarp so that we're going to direct the water down and off the tarp. But Karie's is all vertical poles, and every surface of that shelter is sloped, and it's sloped with a steep pitch, so the water is going to come off really easily, and that is so key in a climate like we are seeing there in Labrador, where it's so dang wet. You can count on just drenching rains really often if what we've been seeing is true. And that is a really good strategy in a bunch of different ways. So one way is how it's going to shed the water, but also if you notice, her shelter is really, really low. So it's a long, slow slope down to the ground. And that's a Buick's wren in the background, one of my favorite birds. So they are going to be really low and close to her. So she has one spot where she can stand up in the entrance, and that is perfect because, again, heat rises. So all of these folks with these tall ceilings, sure, it's easy to move around in, but you are losing so much of your heat. So having a spot where you can stand up comfortably and move around, but having the areas that are like the foot of your bed, you're never going to be standing up, or rarely, and you don't need to stand up by the foot of your bed. So keeping it low, only with enough room for your feet, is brilliant because that is way less surface area to heat. And when your shelter is not that far up above you, then guess what? It is reflecting your body heat back at you. So your body is actually going to be enough to keep that warm. Plus, it's way less materials for her to haul. It's really structurally sound. Remember, triangles are one of the sturdiest shapes in nature because they are, well, in physics, because they're directing all of the force back to the ground rather than to horizontal members that are inherently much weaker. So structurally strong, it's going to be saving her a ton of calories to build it because it's not huge, it's not elaborate. It's going to be saving her a ton of calories to be living in it. It's going to be easy to heat and really make the best use of the calories in her body, keeping her own body warm. There's so many fledgling birds around here right now. There's baby robins and baby jays learning how to catch food all the time. It's very exciting if you're interested in this stuff, which I am, and I hope that people interested in Alone are as well. Anyway, so 100%, and Karie is a longtime friend of mine, but I'm saying this without bias. Igor is a friend of mine too. Jessie is a friend of mine too, and I believe that I am being fairly unbiased when I say Karie's shelter, hands down, my favorite shelter that I have seen thus far on Alone. I will say how she deals with the fire and what she does to allow the smoke to get out but still is able to seal her shelter is going to make a big difference and is going to determine whether I think Adam with his good chimney or JP with his wood stove may or may not be in the running for best shelter overall. But from what I've seen so far, Karie Lee has got it going on. We see Adam out there doing target practice. I have mixed feelings about the idea of it. I certainly thought about doing target practice out there because it's really hard to maintain your aim as your body is changing dramatically on you. And if you're not practicing, a lot of folks and myself before I went out, and I'm guessing most of these folks, because they are so good so far with their bows, probably practicing every day. So when you go from practicing every day to not practicing at all, except when it's a high tension moment when you really need it, that's going to be affecting your aim quite a bit. So keeping that aim dialed with target practice every day, not a bad idea. That said, of course, it also means that you are burning calories needlessly to do that target practice. You are using those muscles a lot, so you're going to be keeping the muscles from atrophying, but at what cost if you don't have the calories feeding those muscles? So might be great, might not be. That said, then we see him get a grouse with his bow, which of course, freaking awesome. Super excited to see him getting that grouse. And we get a really great shot of the fletching, which I talked about last week, that long, shaggy fletching that's designed to catch air and slow your arrows. So that means he's less likely to lose these arrows, which is awesome. We saw him lose a broadhead last time, and I'm guessing it didn't have fletching because a broadhead is something that you're more likely taking a longer shot with. So the other thing about the target practice is there's a risk that you can lose your arrows, particularly in deep, boggy soils like that. Even if you know where that arrow went, sometimes it can just get swallowed up by that boggy sphagnum moss and can be hard to find regardless, or it can get damaged. It could look like moss and then there's a rock down there. I had a lot of arrows get broken by hitting rocks because I had mostly bare rocks where I was. So, you know, as with anything, positives, negatives, and you just got to weigh it out for yourself and decide what's the best move for you, because it's going to be different for everybody out there. I want to talk too about what we're seeing Adam do in terms of plucking that grouse. We saw Karie do the same thing. Not sure if they've showed everybody with whether they're plucking or skinning. So that's an important thing, because skinning a bird is way faster. Plucking a bird takes a long time, but on birds and on most animals, a lot of the fat is under the skin and actually attached to the skin. So if we skin the animal, then it's going to be really easy to get that meat out cleanly, quickly, but we're missing a lot of the fat. As most of us who have eaten some chicken skin or some turkey skin know, oh my gosh, crispy, crackly, salty, delicious, right? It gets so crackly, crispy, delicious because it's full of fat. So you want that food. You want to take the time to pluck your bird before cooking it on alone. Anywhere but on alone where the calories really matter, it's really important. We then see Adam do one of the things that I warn folks about, which is roasting a bird. He roasts it though in a Dutch oven as opposed to just on top of the fire. So he's saving all of the fat. But what happens is when you have it not in water, but just in the Dutch oven, you can see how it's pretty blackened. So the fat that you're saving is usually going to be burning up on the bottom of the pan anyway. So essentially you are still losing it. And you can hear that crispy skin as he's crunching on that bird. And it sounds so delicious. And it's wonderful. But he's burnt up some of the fat in doing that. So I still think that even in a Dutch oven, it's better to cook that animal in water to make sure that you're not burning it and to make sure that you're getting every bit of that super vitally important fat. Another thing that we see with Adam when he's out hunting for that grouse is that he has bow-mounted arrows. So you can either bring a quiver or you can bring a bow-mounted arrow mount. And a lot of people choose to go with the bow mount, which is a really, really great idea for hunting. It's super efficient to have your arrows right there on your bow. It's really easy to nock your next arrow. But in my mind, even though it is less efficient for hunting, a quiver is a better idea because there are a lot of raw materials on a quiver, a lot of ways that you can repurpose a quiver. You can use it as a container. There's all kinds of things you can do with it, whether you pull it apart to repurpose or whether you just use it as is. A leather quiver even is going to be able to hold water for a while if it's tightly sewn. So you can even use it as a water bottle / canteen. You can cut it up and use it for cordage, lots of things. So in that way, I think a quiver is a better way to go on alone, given the restrictions of alone versus the bow-mounted arrow holders. But again, if what you're used to hunting with is all of those arrows on your bow ready to go, then maybe it feels worth it to you. We see Adam sitting with a critical choice, which is whether he's going to put in the energies to go out stalking and actively hunting all the time versus conserving calories and doing more passive hunting and fishing styles. And he says, you know what, in this environment, I'm pretty much depending on getting a bear, so I'm going all in with hunting. Now, there are different ways to do big game hunting. There's still hunting, which would be something like a blind or a tree sit, sitting in one place and waiting for the game to come to you, versus stalking. Stalking is going to be using a lot more energy, obviously, but you're also more likely to encounter more. It's hard when you're in a totally new environment and you don't know the area, you don't know the movements of the game, to choose a good spot for still hunting. But just like anything on alone, it's always a matter of the calorie equation and whether you're more likely to get game out stalking versus sitting still, but you're less likely to use up so many calories sitting still. So we'll see. I think it's a good call for Adam to say, you know, I'm not here to play the starvation game. I'm either getting some big game or I'm not, and I'm probably not staying. So for him, it seems like that's a good strategy. Just go all in on hunting. And those are some of those hard decisions that you just have to make when you're out in a rugged survival situation like these folks are facing in Labrador. Finally, we wrap up this episode with seeing Benji looking at how much beaver sign there is in his area. Tons of beaver sign, tons of beaver activity. So I said I would talk about beaver as a game animal after talking about bear. And the thing about beaver is it is such rich meat because beavers are aquatic and they're good at holding their breath for a really long time. So the thing with muscle meat, when we talk about dark meat versus light meat, dark meat has so much more iron and it's usually richer and has a higher fat content as well. And the reason why we see really dark meat in animals is it's those muscles that they use the most that have to be able to store oxygen long term. So on chickens, which are ground birds that go running around, also true with quail and grouse and that kind of thing, we tend to see the dark meat in the legs and the light meat in the breast. With goose and ducks, which are migratory birds that depend on their flight muscles to keep them in the air for 12, 16 plus hours a day, we see the dark meat in those wing muscles, in that breast meat, right? So beavers, similarly, because they are really active creatures and they spend a lot of time down underwater holding their breath, they need to be able to store a lot of oxygen in their muscle tissues. And this is what gives their meat such a dark, rich, just fatty, delicious, full of protein, full of vitamin and nutrients in that meat. So really awesome thing to eat. They're also very fatty because, of course, they're underwater in really cold water all the time. So they have a ton of body fat to help insulate them. And then they also store a lot of fat in their tail. So the inside of a beaver tail is like rich, dark, yellowy fat full of really good nutrients, not just the calories, but lots and lots of nutrition as well. So beaver is an awesome food source and so delicious. So Benji, awesome resource to have that. So we see him going out after that beaver and we see him take what is a really good shot and it looks like that beaver is flipping around in the water. Now, when beaver get scared, they slap their tails on the water. So the fact that it freaks out and slaps doesn't mean it's not like a solid slap like we often see when they're trying to scare something off, but it's flipping out there. It might be that it's because it actually got hit, or it might just be its defense reaction. We see him get a second shot out, and this time it really looks like he for sure hit that beaver. And we even see some water splash up, and it's a little bit reddish. And it's hard to tell if that's from the tannins in the water. We saw in Benji's fishing spot earlier that the water was really dark brown, so it might be from the water and not from blood, but it might be blood. It might have been a really good mortal wound on that animal. However, the beaver dives, right? So he doesn't get the beaver. Now he's thinking, why did it dive? Where did it go? I don't understand. That was such a good hit. Well, beaver, again, are aquatic animals. So deep water is their safe place. If they are wounded, that's their instinct. That's what they're going to do because up above the water, that's where predators are. That's where danger lives. Down beneath the water, that's where they are safe. That's the entrance to their lodge. So I'm not surprised at all that that beaver dove with an arrow or with a mortal wound. It's what you would expect. And this is why in beaver trapping, particularly more primitive style trapping rather than modern conibear traps with beaver, we're usually going to be tying a rock to that snare because beaver, they're bullet shaped, right? They don't have a real distinct neck. So when you get one in a snare, it's not actually cutting off its blood supply like snares for other animals are. It's actually just debilitating it, and that beaver is going to feel unsafe. It's going to dive down, and then the rock is going to keep the beaver from coming out. So we use that part of beaver behavior for trapping beaver. So that is exactly what that beaver is displaying when it dives. Big mystery that we are left with because Benji, he is a big guy. He's been working hard on that big shelter and he is going to need a lot of calories to keep himself going. He's super strong and muscly, and muscles burn a lot of calories, right? He looks like he probably has the highest metabolism of anyone out there because of how muscly he is. So he needs this beaver. And to get a good shot and know that you've wounded, probably mortally wounded that animal, it's just heartbreaking, both because your body needs it and because it feels really awful to do another animal really grievous injury without getting the reward of getting to eat it. It's like it feels sadistic just to hurt something for no good reason, right? So I really feel for Benji how hard it is and how sick he feels about shooting that beaver and not getting it. So they cut us off. They like to leave us with a cliffhanger. So we will see what happens with that beaver. I'm guessing it's likely that he's going to get it because we saw someone reaching out towards a beaver floating in the water in that trailer, hoping it's Benji. I hope it's that beaver, and it remains to be seen. So if you like this video and you'd like to see me do more of them, please subscribe to my channel, hit the notifications bell and the like button, and please consider supporting me on Patreon, where you are supporting me putting more of these videos out and also get all kinds of awesome videos like the live Q&A sessions with myself and the other Alone participants, where you get to interact with them, you get to ask your questions yourself. We did our first call this week, and we've got another one coming up in 2 more weeks. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you for episode 4.